At our anniversary party, my husband demanded the deed to my house in front of 100 guests. When I refused, he slapped me hard. I walked out and made one phone call. 30 minutes later, a man walked into the hall, and when my husband saw who he was, his face turned white. I never thought I would tell this story. For 25 years, I kept silent. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I nodded when I wanted to run. I played the role of the dutiful wife so perfectly that even I forgot who I really was. But that night, the night of our silver anniversary, the mask finally cracked. Not mine, but his. And what spilled out was something so ugly, so calculated, that even now, sitting in my study with a glass of wine and the deed to everything he ever wanted clutched in my hand, I still shiver when I remember the look in his eyes. My name is Eleanor Ashford. I am 62 years old, and this is the story of how my husband tried to steal my life and how I took his instead. Thank you for being here. This story isn't easy to tell, but knowing you're listening makes it easier. Stay with me until the end, and if you want, let me know where you're from in the comments. I'm curious how far these words will travel. The house where it all happened is a Georgian manor on 12 acres of manicured land just outside of Hartford. It has 17 rooms, a ballroom that can hold 200 people, and a wine cellar that my father spent 40 years curating. The house has been in my family since 1952, when my grandfather purchased it with money he earned running a small grocery store in the Italian neighborhood of Providence. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, for 30 years to afford that house. When he finally handed my father the keys, he said, "This is your castle now. Never let anyone take it from you." My father, Edward Ashford, built his real estate empire from nothing. An immigrant's son who started by buying condemned buildings and turning them into homes. He would wake at 4 a.m. and not return until midnight, covered in sawdust and paint, his hands calloused and bleeding. By the time he died, he owned half the commercial property in 3 states. Shopping centers, office buildings, apartment complexes, all bearing the Ashford name, all built on the foundation of hard work and honest dealing. And he left it all to me, not to my brother, who had disappointed him by gambling away his inheritance before he even received it. Not to charity, though he gave generously throughout his life. To me, his only daughter, the one who sat with him every Sunday and listened to his stories about the old country, the one who helped him balance the books when I was only 12 years old, the one who understood, even as a child, that wealth was not about spending money, but about building something that would outlast you. But here's the thing that Richard never understood, the thing that I let him not understand for 25 years. I was never just Edward Ashford's daughter. I was his student, his protege, his secret weapon. When other girls my age were learning to bake cookies and sew dresses, my father was teaching me to read balance sheets and evaluate property values. When my friends were going to dances and football games, I was sitting in on meetings with contractors and bankers, silent and observant, absorbing everything. My father believed that women were underestimated in business, and he saw that as an advantage, not a limitation. "Eleanor," he would say, tapping his temple with one weathered finger, "the world will always underestimate you. Let them. Their blindness is your armor. While they're busy thinking you're just a pretty face, you can be 3 moves ahead." Richard thought he married a sheltered heiress with a big house and a bigger trust fund. What he actually married was a woman who had been trained since childhood to manage a fortune, to read contracts like poetry, and to never, ever let a man see how smart she really was. I wore that armor for 25 years. And on the night of my anniversary party, I finally took it off. Let me tell you about the man I married. Richard Cole was everything a young woman in 1987 thought she wanted. Tall, dark-haired, with a smile that could charm the paint off walls. He came from old Connecticut money, or so he claimed, and had the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. We met at a charity gala where he spent the entire evening making me laugh with stories about his travels in Europe and his plans to build a real estate empire that would rival anything on the East Coast. I was 37 years old and had never been married. My father had been dead for 2 years, and I was still grieving, still learning how to live without his guidance. Richard seemed like a gift, a partner who understood my world, who could help me manage the empire my father had built, who would stand beside me as an equal. I was a fool, but I didn't know it yet. The wedding was beautiful. 200 guests, a ceremony in the garden of this very house, a reception that lasted until dawn. Richard moved in immediately, and for the first few years, things were good. He started his own construction company with a loan from my trust. Just seed money, he called it. I'll pay it back with interest. And threw himself into building his own legacy. I supported him. Of course I did. That's what wives did. I attended his business dinners and smiled at his partners and pretended not to notice when the contracts came in slower than he had promised. I hosted parties and made connections and introduced him to everyone who mattered in Hartford's business community. I was the perfect corporate wife, decorative and supportive and utterly unthreatening. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, Richard began to take over. First, it was the household accounts. You shouldn't have to worry about these details, Eleanor. Let me handle the finances while you focus on the house. Then it was the trust meetings. There's no need for you to sit through those boring discussions. I'll represent your interests. We're married, after all. Then it was the decisions, big and small. What car to buy, where to vacation, which charities to support, which friends to keep, and which to let fade away. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself it was love. I told myself that this was what marriage looked like. Two people becoming one, sharing everything, making decisions together. But we weren't making decisions together. Richard was making decisions, and I was agreeing to them. And by the time I realized the difference, I had already given away more power than I knew I had. The party was Richard's idea, of course. Everything was always Richard's idea. He wanted the ballroom filled with crystal and candlelight. He wanted a string quartet playing Vivaldi. He wanted 100 of our closest friends, most of whom were his business associates and their trophy wives, to witness what a wonderful life he had built for us. What a wonderful life he had built. The irony of that phrase still makes me laugh, though there's no humor in it. Richard hadn't built anything. He had borrowed and spent and schemed, and when his schemes failed, he had borrowed more. The wonderful life he wanted to celebrate was built on my father's money, my family's land, my name and reputation. He was a parasite wearing a tuxedo, and I was the host he had been feeding on for 25 years. But I didn't know the full extent of it that night. Not yet. All I knew was that something was wrong. I remember standing in our bedroom that evening, zipping up the emerald gown he had chosen for me. Always green, always emerald. Because it was his favorite color, and he liked to see me wearing it and feeling a strange coldness in my chest. Something was off. Something had been off for months, actually. But I had pushed it down, buried it under the routine of daily life. The way he had been looking at me lately, not with the casual indifference I had grown used to, but with something sharper. Calculation, anticipation, like a man waiting for a trap to spring. There had been other signs too, signs I had chosen to ignore. The late nights at the office that had become more frequent. The phone calls he took in another room, his voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't quite hear. The new suits and expensive watches that appeared without explanation. The way his secretary looked at me with something that might have been pity when I stopped by his office unannounced. I should have trusted my instincts then. My father would have been disappointed that I didn't. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that after 25 years of marriage, I knew Richard. I knew his weaknesses, his vanity, his need for admiration, his conviction that he was the smartest person in every room. I knew his routines. The gym at 6, the office by 8, home by 7 with a scotch in his hand, and complaints about his partners on his lips. I knew the way he made love to me. Mechanical, perfunctory, always on Saturday nights, always with the lights off, always ending with him turning away and falling asleep before I had even caught my breath. What I didn't know was Vanessa. The party was in full swing when I first noticed her. The ballroom was glowing with candlelight, and the string quartet was playing something by Bach that my father would have loved. I was making my rounds as the hostess, smiling and nodding and accepting compliments on the flowers and the food and the house, when I caught sight of them by the ice sculpture. The sculpture was Richard's idea, of course, a ridiculous swan made of ice, slowly melting in the warmth of the room, dripping water onto the white tablecloth beneath it. He thought it was elegant. I thought it was wasteful. But there they were, standing beside it, my husband and a woman I had never seen before, talking with an intimacy that made my stomach clench. She was young, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp, hungry beauty that comes from ambition rather than genetics. Her cheekbones were razors, her eyes were dark and knowing, and her smile had a predatory edge that made me think of foxes circling a henhouse. Her dress was red, not the soft rose of a romantic dinner, but the aggressive crimson of a stop sign, cut low enough to be memorable but not quite scandalous. Professional, deliberate, every inch of her designed to attract and command attention. Richard was leaning toward her with a familiarity that went beyond professional acquaintance. His hand hovered at the small of her back, not quite touching, but close enough to claim. His eyes were locked on hers with an intensity I hadn't seen directed at me in years, perhaps ever, and she was looking back at him with an expression I recognized immediately: possession. She thought she owned him. And from the way he was looking at her, maybe she did. Richard introduced her as his new legal counsel. "Vanessa Pierce," he said, his hand finally making contact with her back, lingering there a moment too long. "She's been helping me restructure some investments. Brilliant mind. Harvard Law. I'm lucky to have found her. As if she were a lost puppy rather than a shark in designer heels. I smiled and extended my hand. "How lovely to meet you. Richard has mentioned how helpful you've been." Her handshake was firm, too firm, a power play disguised as a greeting. Her eyes were cold, assessing me with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. I could see her cataloging my age, my weight, my dress, my jewelry, filing each detail away for future reference. She was measuring me, I realized, measuring me and finding me wanting. And in that moment, I knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. But I am my father's daughter, so I kept smiling. "Richard speaks so highly of you," Vanessa said, her voice honey-sweet and just as sticky. "He says you're the heart of this house, that none of this would exist without you." The flattery was too smooth, too practiced. She had rehearsed those words, I realized. She had anticipated this meeting and prepared her lines the way an actress prepares for a performance. This wasn't a spontaneous compliment, it was a carefully placed chess move. "That's very kind of him to say," I replied, matching her tone. "But the house belongs to my family. I just live in it." Something flickered in her eyes at that. Surprise, maybe? Or reassessment? I had corrected her assumption without appearing to, had reminded her that whatever claim she thought she had, the power here resided with me. It was a small victory, but it felt good. Richard stepped in then, his voice a little too loud, a little too jovial. "Eleanor, Vanessa was just telling me about a wonderful investment opportunity. We should discuss it later." "Of course, dear," I said. "But for now, I should check on the caterers. Please enjoy the party, Miss Pierce." I walked away before either of them could respond, my back straight, my head high. I could feel their eyes on me as I moved through the crowd, could feel them exchanging glances behind my back. Let them look. Let them whisper. Let them think they were fooling me. My father taught me many things, but the most important was this: never let your enemy see you bleed. The evening progressed the way these evenings always did. Champagne flowed from crystal flutes and that had belonged to my grandmother. Canapés circulated on silver trays that bore the Ashford crest. Guests complimented the house, the food, the flowers, the music, the same compliments they had given at every party for the past 25 years. Richard worked the room like the politician he had always wanted to be, shaking hands and slapping backs and laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I played my part too, the gracious hostess, asking about children and vacations and renovations, nodding at the right moments, laughing at the right times, but I was watching. I had been watching my whole life. I watched Richard refill Vanessa's glass 3 times, his fingers brushing hers as he handed it over. I watched them step onto the terrace together and return 15 minutes later, her lipstick slightly smudged, his collar askew. I watched my mother-in-law, Dolores, greet Vanessa with the warmth she had never once shown me in 25 years of marriage. Air kisses and genuine smiles and whispered confidences that made them both laugh. Dolores had always hated me. From the moment Richard brought me home, she had made it clear that I was not good enough for her precious son. My money was too new, my family too immigrant, my manner too quiet and bookish. She wanted him to marry someone flashy, someone who would throw parties and join country clubs and spend his money with the careless abandon of the truly wealthy. Instead, he married me, a woman who invested instead of spending, who preferred books to balls, who treated the family fortune as a sacred trust rather than a personal piggy bank. And now, here she was, giggling with my husband's mistress like they were sorority sisters, their heads bent together in conspiracy. Whatever they were planning, I was not meant to know about it, but I would find out. I always found out. My father had taught me that too. At 10 o'clock, Richard clinked his glass and asked for everyone's attention. The string quartet fell silent. The waiters stopped circulating. 100 faces turned toward my husband as he climbed the 3 steps to the small stage we had set up at one end of the ballroom. 25 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease, I married the most wonderful woman in the world. The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. I had heard them before, at other parties, other celebrations. They had lost whatever meaning they once had. Eleanor has been my partner, my confidant, my rock. She has supported me through every challenge, celebrated every success, and made this house, this beautiful house that her father built, into a home. There was applause. I smiled modestly, the way I was supposed to. And now, Richard continued, his eyes finding mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle, I want to ask her for one more thing, one more gift, to celebrate 25 years of partnership. He walked toward me. The room fell silent. 100 faces watched with the hungry curiosity that tragedy always attracts. Eleanor, he said, taking my hands in his. His palms were damp, I noticed. He was nervous. Why would he be nervous? This house has been in your family for 3 generations. It's your father's legacy, your heritage, and I know how much it means to you. My heart was pounding now, not with anticipation, with warning. But we've talked about this, he continued, his voice dropping to something that was meant to sound intimate but came out desperate. We've talked about simplifying, about liquefying assets, about moving forward into our next chapter together. We had never talked about this. Not once. Not ever. In 25 years of marriage, Richard had never expressed any interest in simplifying anything. He liked things complicated. The more complicated, the better, because complications provided cover for whatever schemes he was running. So tonight, in front of all our friends, I want to ask you something. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a document. I recognized it immediately. The deed to my house. My house. The house my grandfather had worked his whole life to afford. The house where I was born. The house where I had learned to walk and talk and read and love. The house that had been in my family since before Richard Cole even existed. I want to ask you to sign this deed over to me, to us, as a symbol of our unity, our partnership, our trust. The room held its breath. I looked at the document in his hands. I looked at the 100 faces watching me, some curious, some uncomfortable. Some, like Vanessa's and Dolores's, eager with anticipation. I looked at the house around me, at the walls that had witnessed 3 generations of Ashford joys and sorrows, at the crystal chandeliers my grandmother had chosen, at the marble floors my grandfather had installed with his own hands. And then I looked at my husband, at the man I had shared a bed with for 25 years, at the man who had just asked me, no, demanded that I sign away my birthright in front of 100 witnesses, as though it were a romantic gesture rather than a calculated theft. I understood everything in that moment: the affair, the nervousness, the presence of his mistress and his mother, both watching with barely concealed excitement, the document, conveniently prepared in advance, the public setting, chosen so I would be too embarrassed to refuse. He had planned this. They had all planned this. And they had expected me to smile and sign and give away everything my family had worked for, just to avoid making a scene. No, the word came out quietly, but it carried. In the silence of that ballroom, it might as well have been a gunshot. Richard's smile flickered. "I'm sorry?" I said no. I pulled my hands from his. "This house belongs to the Ashford family. It will continue to belong to the Ashford family. I will not sign it over to you or to anyone else." For a moment, he just stared at me. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid recalibration of a plan gone wrong. He had expected me to be flattered, moved. He had expected me to sign without thinking, the way I had always signed whatever he put in front of me, or so he thought. He had expected his obedient wife to play her role one more time. But I was done playing. "Eleanor," his voice was low now, dangerous. "We discussed this." "We never discussed this, Richard. You never mentioned this document. You never asked my opinion. You assumed I would simply do what you wanted, the way I always have." I kept my voice calm, but inside I was trembling. Not with fear, but with something else. Something that felt almost like exhilaration. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, but no." The room was silent. 100 people stood frozen, champagne glasses suspended in midair, watching the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of spectators at a car accident. I could feel their eyes on me, could feel their judgment and their curiosity and their barely concealed excitement. This would be the story they told at dinner parties for years to come. The night Eleanor Ashford refused her husband in front of everyone. Let them talk. Let them remember. Richard's face had changed. The charming smile was gone, replaced by something I had seen only glimpses of over the years, something cold and cruel and utterly contemptuous. This was the real Richard, I realized. The one he hid behind expensive suits and easy laughter. The one who looked at me and saw not a wife, but an obstacle. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed. "You're embarrassing us. Sign the document." "No." "Eleanor." He grabbed my wrist. "Sign it. Now." I tried to pull away. His grip tightened, hard enough to bruise. I felt the bones of my wrist grinding together under his fingers, felt the sharp pain of it shooting up my arm. "Let go of me. You stupid woman." The words came out in a snarl, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. "You think you understand anything? You think you have any idea what's happening here? Sign the deed, or I swear to God." "You'll what?" I looked him in the eye, saw the fury there, the desperation. "Hit me? In front of 100 witnesses?" The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed, no one moved. The candles flickered in the chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. The world continued turning, indifferent to the drama unfolding in my family's ballroom. And then Richard Cole did something that changed everything. He slapped me. Not a gentle slap, not a theatrical gesture. A hard, backhanded blow that snapped my head to the side and sent me stumbling into the table behind me. I felt crystal shattering against my hip. I felt champagne soaking through my emerald gown, cold and shocking. I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. The sound of it, the sharp crack of his hand against my face, echoed through the ballroom like a thunderclap. And I felt something else, something that rose up from deep inside me, from the place where I had buried Eleanor Ashford for 25 years. Clarity. The room erupted into chaos. Women gasped, men shouted. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered against the marble floor. Someone else was crying. My daughter Clara, I realized, standing in the doorway in her blue dress, her phone raised, her face white with shock. She was recording. My daughter was recording everything. Good. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse into hysterics, or beg for help, or do any of the things a woman is supposed to do when her husband strikes her in public. I stood up straight. I wiped the blood from my lip with the back of my hand. And I looked at my husband, really looked at him. For the first time in 25 years. I saw him clearly now. The graying temples that he dyed to look younger. The expensive suit that hid a body gone soft with indulgence. The handsome face that had charmed me once, now twisted with rage and fear and something that might have been regret. He knew he had made a mistake. I could see it in his eyes. The plan had called for me to sign the deed quietly, meekly, the way I had always done what he wanted. The plan had not called for violence. The plan had not called for 100 witnesses to see him lose control. But it was too late for plans now. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, I said quietly. Then I walked out of the ballroom. I could hear Richard calling after me, his voice alternating between rage and something that might have been fear. I could hear Vanessa telling him to calm down, that we could fix this, that no one would believe me. I could hear Dolores screeching about ungrateful wives and family loyalty, her shrill voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. I heard all of it, and I kept walking. I went to my father's study, the room that Richard had never been allowed to enter, though he had tried many times over the years. The room where I kept the things that mattered, my father's first contract, framed on the wall, my mother's pearls, locked in the safe, a photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, standing in front of the grocery store that had started it all, and a small black book with a phone number that I had memorized but never used. I sat down at my father's desk, a massive oak piece that he had bought at an auction in 1975, refinished with his own hands, and sat behind for 30 years. I ran my fingers across the wood, feeling the grooves and scratches that told the story of a life's work. Then I picked up the phone, and I dialed. "Mr. Castellano's residence," a voice answered. "This is Eleanor Ashford," I said. "I need to speak with Anthony immediately. Tell him it's about the Ashford Trust. Tell him my husband just struck me in front of 100 witnesses. And tell him..." I paused, looking at my reflection in the dark window. The blood on my lip, the champagne staining my gown, the steel in my eyes. Tell him to bring the file on Richard Cole's company, all of it. There was a brief silence. Then, "One moment, Mrs. Ashford." 20 seconds later, a familiar voice came on the line. Anthony Castellano, my father's oldest friend, his attorney for 40 years, the man who had drawn up my trust documents when I was still a teenager, the man who had attended my wedding and stood beside my father, watching with worried eyes as I said, "I do," to a man neither of them fully trusted. He had warned me, Anthony, gently, carefully, without ever directly criticizing Richard. He had asked questions about the prenuptial agreement Richard wanted me to sign, about the businesses Richard wanted to start, about the investments Richard wanted to make with my money. He had planted seeds of doubt that I had refused to water, too in love and too hopeful to see what he was trying to show me. And when I finally came to him 3 years ago, suspicion gnawing at my stomach, asking for help investigating the discrepancies I had found in our accounts, he had not said, "I told you so." He had simply nodded and said, "Let me make some calls." 3 years. 3 years of watching, waiting, gathering evidence while Richard grew more confident and more careless. 3 years of playing the fool while building an arsenal. "Eleanor." His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who had seen worse and survived it. "Tell me what happened." I told him. Everything. The demand, the refusal, the slap, the document, Vanessa. All of it in clear, precise detail. The way my father had taught me to report problems. No emotion, no embellishment, just facts. And when I finished, there was a long pause. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Anthony said finally. "I'm bringing everything. The financial records, the corporate filings, the surveillance photographs." He paused. "And Eleanor, I think it's time your husband learned who he really married." I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my father's study, my hand pressed against my bruised cheek, my heart pounding with something that felt almost like joy. For 25 years, I had played the fool. I had let Richard believe he was the clever one, the powerful one, the one in control. I had signed documents without appearing to read them, though I had read every word late at night, photographing the pages with a camera disguised as a pen. I had asked no questions about his business dealings, though I had reviewed every quarterly report, every tax return, every wire transfer, with the help of a forensic accountant who answered only to Anthony Castellano. I had been the perfect, passive, stupid wife. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you time. Time to watch, time to learn, time to plan. And I had planned for this moment for 3 very long years. It started when I found the first discrepancy. A withdrawal from our joint account that didn't match any expense I could identify. Small, just a few $1,000s, but wrong. I mentioned it to Richard casually, over breakfast, watching his face carefully as he explained it away. A business lunch? A client gift. Nothing to worry about. His eyes had flickered when he said it. Just for a moment, just enough for me to notice. Nothing to worry about. But my father had taught me to worry about small things. "The big betrayals always start small," he used to say, sitting in this very chair, pointing at a spreadsheet with his pen. "A missing $1 today. A missing $1,000,000 tomorrow. Watch the details, Eleanor. The details will tell you everything." So I watched. I called Anthony the first time I'd contacted him about financial matters since my father's death, and asked for his help, not Richard's help, not our accountant's help. My father's friend, who had known me since I was a baby, who had bounced me on his knee at Christmas parties, who had wept at my father's funeral as though he had lost a brother. Anthony listened. And then he said the words that changed everything. "I've been worried about this for years. Let me make some calls." The calls led to meetings. The meetings led to documents. The documents led to a picture so damning that I had trouble sleeping for weeks after I saw it. Richard Cole, my husband of 25 years, had been systematically embezzling money from his own company for nearly a decade. Not small amounts, millions. He funneled it through shell corporations with innocuous names: Horizon Consulting, Pacific Ventures, Eastern Holdings, companies that had no employees, no offices, and no legitimate business purpose. They existed solely to receive funds embezzled from coal construction and redirect them to accounts that Richard thought I couldn't see. He used the money to fund a lifestyle I knew nothing about. A penthouse on Park Avenue, purchased in cash, registered to a holding company controlled by someone named V. Pierce. A sports car, a red Ferrari, the cliché of a midlife crisis, registered to the same mysterious V. Pierce. Trips to islands I had never visited, booked under names I didn't recognize, paid for with credit cards I had never seen. Vanessa Pierce, the brilliant legal mind, the Harvard law graduate, not just his mistress, I learned, his partner in crime, the architect of his fraud. She had designed the shell companies, structured the transfers, created the paper trails that were meant to be impossible to follow. But nothing is impossible if you have enough time, enough resources, and enough motivation. And I had all 3. I learned other things too. Things that made my blood run cold. Richard had been planning to leave me. Not just divorce me. That would have triggered the prenuptial agreement, which protected my assets from any claim he might make. No. He had something more elegant in mind. With Vanessa's help He was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent, forged medical records, paid testimony from doctors I had never seen, a paper trail suggesting that I was suffering from early onset dementia, unable to manage my own affairs. If he succeeded, he would become my legal guardian. He would control my trust. He would control my house. He would control everything my family had built over 3 generations, and I would be locked away in some facility while he and his mistress spent my inheritance. The audacity of it took my breath away, but it also made me angry, angrier than I had ever been in my life. I told Anthony everything I had learned, and then I asked him to help me set a trap. Here was the part that Richard didn't know, the part that made me smile even as I discovered the depths of his betrayal. Richard's company, Cole Construction, had been struggling for years. Bad investments, market downturns, contracts that fell through. He needed capital, desperately, to keep the business afloat while he continued to siphon off its profits. He found it in what he thought was an anonymous investment group, the Whitmore Group, they called themselves, operating out of a prestigious address in New York. Venture partners who asked no questions and expected only returns. Those partners were me. Or rather, they were the Ashford Trust, managed by Anthony Castellano, invested through a series of holding companies that Richard's lawyers never thought to investigate. Why would they? The money was good, the terms were favorable, and the investors seemed content to remain silent. When Richard borrowed $2 million to cover his embezzlement, he borrowed it from his wife. When he signed over 20% of his company as collateral, he signed it over to the woman sleeping beside him every night. And when he demanded the deed to my house, thinking he had finally cornered his prey, he had no idea that the prey had become the hunter. He didn't know. He had never known. And tonight, he was finally going to find out. I sat in the darkness of my father's study and waited. Outside, I could hear the party continuing. The music had stopped, but the voices were loud, confused, scandalized. The guests would be gossiping, taking sides, already composing the stories they would tell tomorrow. Richard would be doing damage control, I knew. Vanessa would be whispering in his ear, telling him to calm down, telling him they could spin this. Dolores would be defending her precious son to anyone who would listen. Let them spin. Let them defend. The truth was coming, and no amount of spin could stop it. My daughter Clara would be, where? I hope she was safe. I hope she was with friends, with people who would protect her from what was about to happen. I hoped she had stopped recording. Actually, no. I hoped she had recorded everything. Every word, every moment, every second of her father's violence. That recording would be worth more than any document in proving what kind of man Richard Cole really was. 25 minutes later, I heard a car pull up the drive, the crunch of gravel under tires, a door opening and closing. Then another set of footsteps, no, 2 sets, moving quickly toward the house. I heard the front door open. I heard Richard's voice, sharp with surprise and something else. Was that fear? Castellano, what the hell are you doing here? I'm here to see Eleanor. Anthony's voice was calm, measured, utterly unruffled. The voice of a man who has spent 50 years delivering bad news to people who didn't want to hear it. And to deliver some documents. We have business to discuss. Business? This is a private party. This is my house. Actually, Anthony interrupted gently, this is Eleanor's house. It has always been Eleanor's house. But I suspect you knew that, which is why you were so eager to have her sign that deed. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Then footsteps, moving toward the study where I waited. The door opened. Anthony Castellano walked in, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Richard's car. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, heavy with the weight of evidence. Behind him, I could see a crowd gathering in the hallway, guests who should have left but stayed, drawn by the irresistible gravity of scandal. And behind them, his face pale, his eyes wild, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. My husband. Anthony closed the door behind him, leaving Richard and the crowd outside. Then he turned to me with a smile that was almost gentle. "Eleanor," he said, "I brought the file. All of it. The bank records, the corporate filings, the surveillance photographs, the forensic analysis, everything we've gathered over the past 3 years." He set the briefcase on my father's desk and opened it, revealing stacks of papers, folders, photographs. "Are you ready?" I stood up from my father's desk. I touched my bruised cheek one more time, feeling the heat of it, the tender ache that would turn to purple by morning. And I nodded. "I've been ready for 3 years. Let's show my husband who he really married." The room outside had gone silent. Through the heavy oak door, I could hear Richard's voice, muffled but insistent, demanding to know what was happening. I could hear Vanessa trying to calm him down, her voice high and nervous. I could hear Dolores threatening to call the police, as if the police would help her now. I could hear the murmur of 100 guests, waiting, watching, hungry for whatever came next. I straightened my spine, I lifted my chin, and I prepared to walk back into that ballroom and destroy the man I had loved for 25 years. But first, I had one more thing to say to Anthony Castellano. "When we walk out there," I said quietly, "I want you to tell him everything. About the trust, about the investment, about who really owns his company. I want him to understand, in front of everyone he was trying to impress, exactly how badly he miscalculated." Anthony nodded slowly. "And Vanessa?" "Her too." I smiled, and it felt like the first real smile I had worn in years. "I want them both to know that while they were planning to take everything from me, I was already 10 steps ahead." "Your father would be proud," Anthony said softly, his eyes glistening with something that might have been tears. "My father taught me everything I know." I walked to the door and put my hand on the handle. "Now let's go show these people what an Ashford woman is capable of." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Richard was waiting, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Vanessa stood beside him, her red dress bright as a warning sign, her hand on his arm. Behind them, the guests had gathered in a loose semicircle, champagne glasses forgotten, phones raised, recording everything. Good, I thought. Let them record. Let them see. "Eleanor." Richard's voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who knew he was losing but refused to admit it. "What the hell is going on? Why is Castellano here? What documents is he talking about?" I looked at my husband, at the man who had shared my bed for 25 years, at the man who had just humiliated me in front of everyone I knew, at the man who thought he was about to steal everything I had. "Richard," I said calmly, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your finances. Don't you?" His face went pale. And in that moment, I knew that the next hour would change everything. The hallway of my family's home had never felt so long. Each step I took toward the ballroom echoed against the marble floors my grandfather had imported from Italy when I was just a girl. I used to slide across these floors in my socks, laughing, while my mother pretended to scold me, and my father watched with a smile that said he was proud of my spirit. Now I walked them as a woman transformed, with blood drying on my lip and fire burning in my chest. Richard followed close behind, his expensive shoes clicking in anxious rhythm. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, trying to read me, trying to understand what had just happened in that study. For 25 years, he had known exactly who I was, or thought he did. The quiet wife, the passive partner, the woman who asked no questions and signed whatever he put in front of her. He was about to meet the real Eleanor Ashford. Anthony Castellano walked beside me, his leather briefcase heavy with documents that would destroy my husband's life. We had been preparing this moment for 3 years, ever since I first discovered the discrepancies in our accounts. 3 years of watching, waiting, gathering evidence while Richard grew more confident and more careless. 3 years of playing the fool while building an arsenal. The ballroom was still full when we entered. The string quartet had stopped playing. Someone had told them this wasn't the time for Vivaldi, but the guests remained, clustered in groups, whispering behind their hands. They parted for me like water around a stone, their faces a mixture of pity and fascination. I ignored them all. I walked to the center of the room where the small stage had been set up for Richard's grand anniversary speech. I climbed the 3 steps and turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I apologize for the interruption. I know this isn't the evening any of us expected." I touched my swollen lip and saw several women wince. "But since my husband chose to make our private affairs public tonight, I think it's only fair that I do the same." Richard pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Eleanor, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself. You're clearly in shock." "Am I?" I turned to face him directly. "Am I in shock, Richard? Or am I finally seeing clearly for the first time in 25 years? He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "We can discuss this privately. Whatever you think you know, I know about the embezzlement," I said quietly, but loud enough for the front rows to hear. The gasps spread through the room like ripples on a pond. "I know about the shell, companies. I know about the phantom invoices. I know about every dollar you've stolen from your own company." Richard's grip loosened. His face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. "And I know about Vanessa," I continued, turning to look at the woman in the red dress, who was already edging toward the door. "Your brilliant legal counsel, your Harvard-educated mistress, the architect of your fraud." Vanessa froze mid-step. Every eye in the room turned to her. "Eleanor, you don't know what you're talking about." Richard's voice had lost its commanding edge. He sounded desperate now, frightened. "You've been misled. Someone has been feeding you lies." "Have they?" I nodded to Anthony, who stepped forward and opened his briefcase. "Then perhaps you can explain these." Anthony began laying documents on the small table at the edge of the stage. Bank statements, corporate filings, photographs, email printouts. 3 years of evidence meticulously gathered, irrefutably documented. These are records of wire transfers from Cole Construction to a shell company called Horizon Consulting, Anthony said, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who had spent 50 years in courtrooms. Horizon Consulting has no employees, no office, and no legitimate business purpose. It exists solely to receive funds embezzled from your company's accounts. Richard was shaking his head, but his eyes were fixed on the documents with the horrified fascination of a man watching his own execution. "These are receipts for the penthouse on Park Avenue," Anthony continued, laying out more papers. "The one registered to Miss Pierce. Monthly expenses paid from Horizon's accounts, furniture, art, jewelry, a wine collection worth $60,000. I watched Vanessa's face as Anthony spoke. The confident smile had vanished. She looked trapped, cornered, her eyes darting between the door and Richard, as if calculating which escape route offered better odds. "And these," Anthony said, his voice dropping to a more ominous register, "are the loan documents you signed 18 months ago, when your company was failing and you needed capital to cover your tracks. You borrowed $2 million from an investment group you believed was anonymous." Richard nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "The Whitmore Group. They're silent partners. They have no involvement in day-to-day." "The Whitmore Group," Anthony interrupted gently, "is a subsidiary of the Ashford Family Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my husband's face as the implications registered. The confusion first, as he tried to understand what Anthony was saying. Then the disbelief, as the meaning became clear. Then the slow, dawning horror of understanding, spreading across his features like blood seeping into water. "Eleanor has been the majority stakeholder in your company for 18 months, Anthony continued. "When you borrowed money to cover your embezzlement, you borrowed it from your wife. When you signed over 20% equity as collateral, you signed it to the woman you just struck in front of 100 witnesses. Richard turned to look at me. Really look at me. Perhaps for the first time in years. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The suave, confident man I had married had vanished, replaced by someone small and frightened and utterly lost. You thought I was stupid, I said quietly. You thought I was blind. You thought I didn't notice the late nights, the secret phone calls, the way you looked at me like I was furniture you'd grown tired of. I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. You underestimated me, Richard, just like everyone always has. Eleanor, his voice cracked. Eleanor, please. We can work this out. I made mistakes. I know that. But we can fix this. We can go to therapy. You put your hands on me. My voice was ice. You humiliated me in front of everyone we know. And now you want to go to therapy? I wasn't thinking. I was angry. You meant every bit of it. I pulled my arm away from him, stepped back toward Anthony. You've been planning this for months. The document you wanted me to sign tonight, it wasn't just about the house. It was about taking everything. My inheritance. My father's legacy. Everything. Richard's eyes flickered toward Vanessa, just for a moment, but it was enough. She told you to do it, didn't she? I followed his gaze. Your brilliant legal counsel. She convinced you that if you could get me to sign over the house, you could leverage it to cover your losses. Use my father's property to secure loans for your failing company. Vanessa stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. This is ridiculous. Eleanor, you're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Perhaps the trauma of your husband's outburst has affected your judgment. These documents don't prove anything. They prove fraud, Anthony cut in smoothly. Embezzlement, tax evasion, and given your involvement in creating the shell companies, Miss Pierce, conspiracy. He pulled out his phone. The FBI has been investigating coal construction for 6 months. They're quite interested in the documentation we've provided. In fact, I believe they're outside now. As if on cue, there was a commotion at the entrance to the ballroom. Blue uniforms, plainclothes detectives, and badges catching the light from the chandeliers. The murmur of the crowd rose to a roar. Richard grabbed my arm again, his grip desperate now rather than threatening. Eleanor, please. You can stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you don't want to press charges. We can figure this out together. Like we figured out everything together? I pulled free of his grasp. Like the way you figured out how to steal from your own company? How to hide your mistress in a penthouse bought with money you embezzled? How to convince your mother to help you forge my signature on documents I never saw. His face went gray. How did you... I know everything, Richard. I've known for 3 years. I stepped back as 2 officers approached, their badges glinting in the chandelier light. The only thing I didn't know was how far you'd go. I didn't think you'd actually hit me. I didn't think you'd humiliate me in front of everyone we know. I touched my swollen lip again, feeling the sting of it, the reminder of what he had done. But I'm glad you did, because now everyone knows who you really are. The officers flanked my husband. One of them read him his rights, while the other cuffed his hands behind his back. Richard didn't fight them. He seemed to have deflated entirely, all the bravado and charm draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. Across the room, Vanessa tried to slip out through the service entrance. She made it 3 steps before 2 more officers intercepted her. I heard her protests, her demands to speak with her attorney, her insistence that this was all a terrible mistake. I heard it all, and I didn't care. I was watching my husband, the man I had loved once, the man who had shared my bed, fathered my children, sat across from me at 1,000 dinners. The man who had just tried to steal my life and ended up losing his own. Richard, I said, just as the officers began to lead him away. He stopped, turned, met my eyes one final time. I want you to know something, I continued. I want you to understand this clearly, because it's important. You didn't lose tonight because you got caught. You didn't lose because of bad luck or bad timing or bad advice. I stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear my next words. You lost because you married the wrong woman. Or rather, I smiled. and there was no warmth in it, no mercy, no love. You married exactly the right woman. You just never knew it. The officers led him away. The crowd parted. The doors closed behind them. And I stood in the center of the ballroom, in my champagne-stained emerald gown, with blood on my lip and victory in my heart, and I finally let myself breathe. The night after Richard's arrest, I didn't sleep. I sat in my father's study, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and I let myself feel everything I had been suppressing for 3 years. The anger, the grief, the terrible, liberating relief of a mask finally removed. Clara found me there at dawn, curled up on the leather sofa with a cold cup of tea in my hands. My daughter, 23 years old, already more perceptive than her father had ever been, took one look at my face and understood. You knew, she said quietly, settling into the chair across from me. You've known for a long time. 3 years. Why didn't you tell me? I set down the tea, reached out to take her hand. Because I needed to protect you. And because... I paused, searching for the right words. Because I needed to be sure. I needed evidence that couldn't be disputed. I needed to build a case so strong that when it all came out, no one could accuse me of being hysterical or paranoid or vindictive. Clara nodded slowly. She had her father's dark hair, but her grandmother's eyes, sharp, clear, missing nothing. The video I took, at the party, was that part of your plan? No. I squeezed her hand. That was all you, but it helped. It helped enormously. The video had gone viral overnight. 100 phones had captured the moment my husband struck me, but Clara's footage was the clearest, the most damning. It showed everything. Richard's demand, my refusal, the escalating tension, the slap. And then my response, calm, controlled, dignified. The internet had already chosen sides. The hashtag #TeamEleanor was trending by midnight. What happens now? Clara asked. I thought about the question. It was the same question I had been asking myself all night. Now, I said slowly, we rebuild. Your father's company will go through bankruptcy proceedings. There's no saving it, not after this. But the assets that can be recovered will go to the investors he defrauded, most of whom, thanks to the trust, are actually us. So we'll get the money back? Most of it, not all. I stood, walked to the window, looked out at the gardens where I had played as a child. But the money isn't what matters. What matters is that justice was served. What matters is that he can't hurt anyone else. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, Mom, are you okay? I turned to face my daughter. The woman who would inherit everything I had spent my life protecting. The woman who would someday sit in this study, make these decisions, carry this legacy forward. I'm not okay yet, I admitted. 25 years of marriage doesn't end without grief, even when the marriage was built on lies. But I will be okay, eventually. What about Grandma Dolores? She's been calling all night. I felt my jaw tighten. Richard's mother, the woman who had helped him forge documents, who had encouraged his cruelty, who had stood in that ballroom and called me ungrateful while her son struck me across the face. Dolores will be dealt with separately, I said. The police are investigating her involvement in the fraud. If she was as complicit as I believe she was, she'll face her own consequences. Clara nodded, satisfied with this answer. And Vanessa? Vanessa Pierce. I spoke the name like a curse. She was arrested last night, along with your father. The FBI has evidence that she was the primary architect of the shell company scheme. She faces more serious charges than Richard, actually. Conspiracy, fraud, money laundering. I paused. She tried to call me this morning, left a voicemail begging me to help her, claiming she was manipulated, that Richard forced her into it. What did you do? I forwarded the voicemail to the FBI. I smiled grimly. Let them deal with her lies. I'm done. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, depositions, and media requests. Everyone wanted to hear from the woman who had taken down her own husband. TV producers offered exclusive interviews. Publishers dangled book deals. A screenwriter called to discuss movie rights. I declined them all. The story had been told. The truth was out. I had no interest in profiting from my own pain. What I did do in those early days was take stock of what I had left. The house, my father's house, the house Richard had tried to steal, was mine, free and clear. The trust was intact. The investments I had made through Anthony's guidance had grown substantially, even accounting for the losses from Richard's fraud. I was, by any objective measure, wealthy, secure, safe. But I didn't feel safe. I felt raw, exposed, like a wound that had finally been opened after years of festering. 2 weeks after the party, Anthony Castellano came to see me. We sat in the garden where the late autumn sun was warm enough to make the outdoors pleasant. "The indictments came down this morning," he said, handing me a folder. "Richard is facing 12 counts: fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, assault. The assault charge alone, with the video evidence, guarantees some prison time. The financial crimes add decades." I opened the folder, scanned the documents. "And Vanessa?" 15 counts. She was more deeply involved than we originally thought. The FBI traced some of her activities back 5 years, before she even met Richard. She's been running this kind of scheme with other men, other companies. Your husband wasn't her first mark, just her biggest. She was conning him? To some degree. She took advantage of his greed and his arrogance. But Richard was a willing participant. He just thought he was too smart to get caught. I closed the folder. "What about Dolores?" Anthony's expression shifted. "That's more complicated. She was involved in forging your signature on certain documents, but her lawyers are arguing that she was acting under Richard's direction. She may escape serious charges." The trial took 8 months to conclude. I testified twice. Once for the prosecution, once for the civil suit I had filed against Richard and Vanessa for damages. Both times, I sat in the witness box and told my story calmly, clearly, without dramatics or tears. Richard's defense was predictable. I was a controlling wife who had deliberately sabotaged his business, planted evidence, and orchestrated the entire incident at the party to humiliate him. The jury took 4 hours to convict him on all counts. Richard Cole was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Vanessa Pierce received 22 years. After the verdict was read, I walked out of the courthouse into a wall of reporters. I gave them one statement and one statement only. My father used to say that the world will always underestimate a woman who knows her worth. He was right. I hope other women in similar situations take strength from this verdict. You are not alone. You are not powerless. And you do not have to accept the life someone else tries to force upon you. Then I got into my car and went home. 6 months after the trial ended, I sold Richard's company. The proceeds, after paying restitution, came to just over $4 million. I donated half to a women's shelter in Hartford. The other half went into a scholarship fund for young women studying business and finance. I kept the house, of course, my father's house. I had it renovated from top to bottom, erasing every trace of Richard's presence. New furniture, new paint, new memories waiting to be made. On the anniversary of the night Richard struck me, I threw a small party. Clara and her boyfriend, Anthony, who had become something more than a friend by then. A few women from the shelter who had become like sisters to me. We stood in the garden as the sun set, glasses of champagne in hand, and I made a toast. 1 year ago tonight, I thought my life was ending. I thought I had lost everything, but I was wrong. 1 year ago tonight, my life was finally beginning. I raised my glass higher, to truth, to justice, to never, ever letting anyone underestimate us again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. 3 months later. Plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Facility where Richard was serving his sentence. I almost threw it away unopened. What could he possibly have to say? But curiosity won out. I slit the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. "Eleanor," it began, "I know you have no reason to read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry, not just for hitting you, though that haunts me every night. I'm sorry for everything that came before, for the years I spent taking you for granted, for looking at you and seeing a possession instead of a partner. I never knew you. Not really. And that's my fault, not yours. I understand now what I lost, what I threw away. Richard. I read the letter 3 times. Then I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched it burn. That was the last I ever heard from Richard Cole. 2 years after Richard's conviction, I received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her late 20s, dark-haired and nervous. Mrs. Ashford? My name is Hannah. Hannah Cole. I'm Richard's daughter. From before. Richard had another child. A daughter he had never mentioned in 25 years of marriage. Hannah told me about her mother, who had struggled with addiction, about her difficult childhood, about finding the documents after her mother's death. I don't want money, she said quickly. I just wanted to tell you that not everyone in my family is like him. I looked at this young woman, this stranger who shared blood with my children, and I felt something unexpected. Compassion. The Ashford Trust has a scholarship program, I said. I'd like to add your name to the list. Hannah became part of our lives after that. She and Clara bonded over their shared circumstances, became the sisters neither of them had ever had. And I gained another daughter, another heir, another woman to carry the Ashford legacy forward. On the 5th anniversary of the night Richard struck me, I stood in the ballroom where it had all happened. The room had been transformed. It no longer looked like a museum. It looked like a home. I was hosting a celebration. The women's shelter I had supported for years was opening a new wing, funded by the Ashford Foundation. Clara was there with her fiancé. Hannah was there too, newly graduated. Anthony stood beside me, his hand warm on my back. 5 years ago, I told the assembled guests, I learned something important about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I knew, smarter than I showed, and more resilient than anyone gave me credit for. I paused. But I also learned something about the world. I learned that there are too many women in situations like mine. Women who are underestimated, controlled, abused. Women who feel like there's no way out. I straightened my spine. This foundation exists to show them that there is always a way out, that they are not alone, that help is available, that justice is possible, that a life beyond fear is waiting for them if they have the courage to reach for it. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. I slipped away to my father's study, needing a moment alone. The room was exactly as he had left it, except for one addition, a framed photograph showing me and Clara and Hannah standing together in the garden, laughing. You were right, Daddy, I said softly. The world will always underestimate a woman who knows her worth, but sooner or later, the world learns its mistake. It has been 7 years now since the night that changed everything. 7 years since I stopped being the woman Richard wanted and started being the woman I was always meant to become. The Ashford Foundation now operates in 12 states, providing legal aid, financial counseling, and emergency housing for women escaping domestic abuse. We have helped over 4,000 women rebuild their lives. Clara runs the day-to-day operations now. Hannah works alongside her. Anthony and I married 3 years ago in a small ceremony in the garden. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Richard. Not with anger anymore. That burned itself out years ago. What I feel now is something closer to pity. He wasted his one precious life on greed and deception. He is still in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 4 years. Last week, I received a letter from a young woman I have never met. She found the Ashford Foundation online, applied for legal aid, escaped an abusive husband with our help. When I was at my lowest, she wrote, I read your story. I watched the video of that night, and I thought, if she can do it, maybe I can too. You saved my life, Mrs. Ashford. You showed me that strength doesn't always look like fighting back in the moment. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Sometimes it looks like building a trap so perfect that your enemy walks right into it without ever seeing it coming. I framed that letter. It hangs on the wall of my study, next to the photograph of my girls. That is my legacy, showing women that they don't have to accept the roles others create for them, that they can be patient without being passive, that they can be kind without being weak, that they can wait for their moment and, when it comes, seize it with both hands and never let go. I stood up to Richard Cole on the worst night of my life. I took back everything he tried to steal and built something beautiful from the ruins. I proved that the woman he dismissed as stupid, passive, and compliant was smarter, stronger, and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. And I did it all while being exactly who I am. Not loud, not violent, not dramatic, just patient, thorough, devastating. Just Eleanor Ashford, and I wouldn't have it any other way. As I write these final words, the sun is setting over the garden where my children used to play, where my grandchildren play now. Anthony is in the kitchen, making dinner. Clara is on her way over with the kids. Hannah will join us later. The house is full of light and warmth and love. The ghosts that used to haunt these rooms have finally been laid to rest. I am at peace. And somewhere, in a federal prison 2 states away, a man who thought he could take everything from me sits in a cell and contemplates the ruins of his life. He wanted the deed to my house. He got the deed to his own destruction instead. That is what happens when you underestimate an Ashford woman. That is what happens when you slap the hand that could have saved you. That is what happens when you mistake patience for weakness, kindness for stupidity, and silence for surrender. I am Eleanor Ashford. I am 71 years old, and this has been the story of how I stopped being a victim and became a force of nature. The end is not an end, it's a door. And I'm walking through it now, into whatever waits on the other side, with my head high and my spine straight and my father's words echoing in my heart. The world will always underestimate you. Let them. Their blindness is your armor. I did. For 25 years, I did. And when the time came to take off that armor and show them who I really was, they never saw me coming. They never see us coming. And that, more than anything else, is our greatest weapon. Use it wisely. Use it well. Use it to build the life you deserve on the ashes of the life they tried to force you into. That's what I did. That's what you can do too. The only question is, are you ready? I was. I am. And now it's your turn. Stand up, walk out, make the call. Your moment is waiting. Take it.